Okay, we are nearing an end of our study on the church. We'll have, for sure, this session, obviously, and this might be the last session, depending on what y'all think about something at the end of this. It'll make a little bit more sense. But today, our topic is spiritual gifts. Okay, so kind of a brief recap. We've looked at what's the distinction between the church and a church, so global, universal versus a local church. We've talked about the nature of the church, the purpose of the church, the functions of the church membership, church discipline, polity, church government, the offices of the church. So this week we're going to look at kind of the machinery that runs behind the scenes that helps the church function in the way that God has designed it. Okay? Spiritual gifts. So how does this happen? First thing I want to do is give us a definition of spiritual gifts. Spiritual gifts, a spiritual gift is simply divine enablement. I almost could leave it right there. I'm going to keep going, but this is essentially what it is. Divine enablement. Okay? So now we're going to tack on the purpose for church growth. So a spiritual gift is divine enablement specifically for church growth. If you remember the three purposes of the church, we've got ministry to God, ministry to one another, ministry to the world. So this church growth targets all three of those areas, two in particular. And when I talk about church growth here, I want us to understand this in two kind of categories. We've got we're going to do size and strength first. There's a couple of different ways we can think about this. Size and strength, or you might think about this as being width, this as being depth. The church growth targets both the world, that's increasing in size, and one another within the church, that's talking about strength and depth. You might also think about it as the church expanding and then the church maturing. Okay? So church growth, the church is getting numerically larger. That's our hope. That's kind of evangelism is kind of what this is. This over here has to do with the growth of the church internally. It's kind of like in marriage, there is having more children, and then there is watching your children grow and develop. Okay? So size, width, expansion, church growth, but then also strength, maturity, and depth within the church. So now the question is, that I'd like for us to think about for a second, is what is the difference between a spiritual gift and then like a talent or an ability? What are your thoughts? What's the difference?
Well, a talent can be used for anything. I mean, you could have a talent for singing, but if you don't use it for God, then it's just a talent.
Okay. So spiritual gift would be something that's specifically used for God.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What else?
Maybe a talent is something that you can learn.
Okay.
Spiritual gift is something that you learn.
Okay. Yeah. Good. What else?
Or you receive after you become a Christian.
That's right. Yeah, spiritual birth. That's right. Okay.
I think the church develops spiritual growth.
Okay. So you think spiritual gifts can be developed? Yeah, I would agree with you. Yeah. Any other thoughts? So let me just get a little bit more pointed with this. How would we distinguish whether or not sowing could be a spiritual gift? Do what? Okay, so sowing can be a spiritual gift?
It's not listed.
It's not listed in the Bible.
Okay, so then a spiritual gift must be listed in the scriptures as a spiritual gift?
That's a trick question.
It's not a trick question. No, we're just thinking out loud about these things.
Probably.
My point is, initially we think, oh, this is simple, yeah, spiritual gifts. But then when you get to thinking about it, okay, well, what about the gift of positivity? I've heard someone mention before, well, I think I just have the spiritual gift of positivity. I believe they genuinely think they have the spiritual gift of positivity, but the question is that a spiritual gift? What makes something a spiritual gift versus just a positive character trait? You know, this person was positive, but then that unbeliever's positive. So it kind of looks the same. Is it fair to call that a spiritual gift or not? What makes something a spiritual gift?
Something that developed.
Something that's developed. Yeah, I would agree that it can develop sometimes. Yeah.
I think it's all in how you use it.
How you use it. Okay.
You can have all kinds of gifts. You can have a gift of playing the piano. But if you're not playing the piano for the glory of God, then I would say that's just a talent.
Okay.
Not a spiritual gift.
Yeah. So here's what I want to draw out of this for us all, and I think Tom was the one that mentioned it a second ago, is the way that I want us to think about spiritual gifts. I believe that there can be gifts that the Lord gives us outside of what we see in Scripture that would technically be a spiritual gift. But as we think about being gifted with a spiritual gift, all of us are gifted with at least one spiritual gift that is given to us in Scripture, specifically. I'm not saying that there can't be other ones, but the Bible does give some lists about this. Spiritual gifts, I'm going to argue for our definition's purpose, are going to be those gifts that are listed in Scripture for divine enablement for church growth. And there's 4 primary passages here. I really want to be able to list these. I hope this erases okay. Yeah, that's good. All right. Hope you got that down because it's gone. There's 4 primary passages, and really, one of these passages, I'm willing to say that there's 3, but technically, if we're really going to be technical about it, there's 4. So the first passage is going to be Romans 12, verses 6 through 8. Yeah, verses 6 through 8. Okay. I'm going to put 1 Corinthians 12. Let's see here. 4 through 11. And then 1 Corinthians 12. I'm going to just write it again. Verse 28. And then I'm going to give you the last one up here in the corner. We're not going to unpack this one, and I'll explain why. Is Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11, a passage we've turned to a lot in our study here. And the reason I'm not including Ephesians in these 3 lists is because the passage in Ephesians talks about the gifts of God for offices of the church. God has gifted to the church, and then he lists some offices. And so I think that it's fair to call those almost umbrella categories of spiritual gifts. God has gifted them for those roles. That's a spiritual gift. But as far as just the regular spiritual gifts that we might expect to see, I think that it's fair to just think about it in terms of these 3 lists. And we're not going to read all of these right now, though I want you to have them down. I'm going to go through and give you right now all of the gifts that you can see in each one. So you can go ahead and turn to Romans 12, 6 through 8. And I'm going to go ahead and start writing down the gifts that we see here in Romans 12. So we see in this passage a gift of... Oh, good night. Good. The gift of prophecy, gifts of service, teaching, exhortation, or encouragement. I've seen it both ways. Some of these, the wording may be slightly different, but it should generally be the same. Generosity, leadership, and mercy. Okay? Romans 12, 6 through 8, prophecy, service, teaching, exhortation, generosity, leadership, mercy. Now, not all of these, we typically think of a gift as something that we exercise and we do and it can be seen, but some of these are almost more descriptive of a quality within us, and we'll see that here in just a little bit as well. So that's the list here in Romans chapter 12, and then when we get to 1 Corinthians 12, we see an initial list, and then a list kind of at the very end of that passage here. So in 1 Corinthians 12, 4 through 11, we have words of wisdom. We've got words of knowledge. We've got faith. Some put these two together. I'm going to separate it. We've got healing and then various miracles. Some people kind of put that together and say miraculous healing. I think that there can be distinct miracles separate from healing, so we're going to pull that apart. We've got prophecy again. I'm going to call this spiritual discernment. That's discerning between spirits, spiritual discernment. And then I've got, I'm just going to put tongues and interpretation. Speaking tongues and interpreting tongues. Okay? So Romans 12, 1 Corinthians 12, and then this last one here gives us a couple of the same ones, but then two extra ones. So I am going to include this also. Over here, we've got miracles and healing. I'm going to pull that out and have it separate again. Then we've got gifts of help. So helps and administration. And then back to tongues again, both speaking and interpreting tongues. Okay? So there's a little bit of kind of bleeding over between the lists, but we see kind of some different dynamics in each of these. I like to think about some of these as falling underneath different umbrellas. So for instance, if you'll notice, trying to find similarities between some of these, you'll notice some of these are speaking gifts. We've got tongues. We've got words of wisdom. My translation says utterance of wisdom. Utterance of knowledge. Prophecy would be one of those. Teaching. Typically exhortation is going to fall into that. Then we've got some that are almost like character traits or things about us that we should all naturally share anyway. For instance, spiritual gift of faith. Spiritual gift of mercy. Spiritual gift of generosity. These are things that should be true among all believers to varying degrees anyway. So there's different categories. I would argue that there's some categories of gifts that are for a specific time and season. Okay? In the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 3, the famous passage, there's a time for everything. I think that that can also be used to describe some of these. We could spend a lot of time really breaking all of these down. What I'd like to do instead is just at least get these out there for you to see this is what the Bible recognizes as spiritual gifts. If there's something that the Lord has blessed you to be able to do that doesn't fall on this list, I think it's okay and good to say, God has blessed me to be able to do fill in the blank. You know, singing in the choir or serving food on Wednesday nights, which we've got serving right here. There's different things that God has given you that I think it's fine for us to say, God has gifted me to do this, but then we should still look at this and say, all that aside, which one of these has the Lord blessed me with to be able to do so that we can know how we need to serve within the church? And I'll tell you why that's important in just a second. I'm going to give you some just general observations. I'm going to leave this up here, so I'm not going to write this on the board. But if you want to write these down, you can. I'm going to give you some things that we need to keep in mind about spiritual gifts. Okay? The first one I've already mentioned. There seems to be different categories of gifts. Is the first one. There seems to be different categories of gifts. And I'm going to tell you why I think that's important. Sometimes God can gift you in a specific area, and we think, well, this is my little niche, and so I'm just going to stick right here and not branch out. When the Lord has really intended for you to branch out and start to hone your gift in other areas. For instance, we might look at these two gifts right here, words of wisdom, words of knowledge. So it could be that we recognize, for whatever reason, I just seem to instinctively know the wise thing to do in a lot of situations. And we might choose to keep that to ourselves, and the church never benefits from it. So if you combine this with something like words of knowledge, or with teaching, or with exhortation, or leadership, now suddenly this is taking on a whole new life of itself because you're combining it with these other gifts that kind of fall in a similar category. Okay? So that's why I bring that up. And I also bring it up to bring out that sometimes God calls specific people out of the church to do things that require a combination of gifts. For instance, I've had several students in student ministry. I've got one right now. He's a senior in high school, and I am increasingly confident he is going to go on to become a pastor or an evangelist and preach. He's just got a fire within him to do that, and it's excellent. So as I am trying to encourage him in those things, one of the things that I want to look for as a shepherd is, is he demonstrating that he has various gifts that are going to be needed for that office? It's not just a single one of these gifts. There's going to be several of these gifts that are related that I want to look at that whole umbrella category and say, do I think that this brother is gifted for this? And what areas of gifting should he try to pursue as he seeks that office out? Okay, so that's why I mentioned up that there's different categories of gifts. I think that's important. Here's the second observation. And at this point, after you write this down, you can turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 12 if you're not there. Here's the second one. Not all gifts are given to all Christians. Not all gifts are given to all Christians. God distributes the gifts according to his will. So not all gifts are given to all Christians. God distributes the gifts according to his will. We can see this both in Romans 12 and in 1 Corinthians 12, but we're going to make some other observations in 1 Corinthians 12, so that's the passage we can kind of stick with right now. So not all gifts are given to all people. God distributes them according to his will. 1 Corinthians chapter 12. He says he doesn't want them to be uninformed about spiritual gifts in verse 1. And then a little bit further down, he says, starting in verse 4, there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are varieties of service, but the same Lord. There are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who empowers them all in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. For to one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom. To another, the utterance of knowledge. And it kind of keeps going. To another, to another, to another. Okay? Verse 11. All these are empowered by one and the same Spirit, who apportions to each one individually as he wills. If you look forward, fast forward to verse 30, he asks these rhetorical questions. Do all possess gifts of healing? Do all speak with tongues? Do all interpret? But eagerly desire the higher gifts. So not all of the spiritual gifts are given to all. In fact, I don't think there's any one spiritual gift that we look to and say every single Christian has that gift. You might say, well, what about faith, Brother Garrett? We'll get to that in just a second, gifts like that. But I don't think there's any one spiritual gift that is given to every single Christian. God chooses whom to give gifts to, what those gifts are, and when that gift comes. Which brings up a debate within the church. There is this big debate between, okay, well, does God still give out all of these spiritual gifts? For instance, is it possible for me right now to have the spiritual gift of prophecy? Or the spiritual gift of miracles or healings? Or the spiritual gift of tongues is highly debated. Or the spiritual gift of discernment between spirits. What does that mean, and does God still give that out? Are these things still things that are given out today? And there's two kind of general camps. One camp says a lot of these miraculous gifts, God has stopped giving these gifts out today. That was for the early church and its expansion. Today we don't see that. That's called the cessationist camp. God has ceased giving these gifts out. Then there's this other camp called the continuationist camp, and they say, well, God continues to give the gifts out today. All the gifts are still on the table. God can distribute as he wills. I'll tell you, I've been back and forth on whether or not I'm on one side or the other. If I'm being honest, I think I'll probably land somewhere in the middle. I think that God can choose to give out whatever gift He wants whenever He wants. I don't think it's fair to say, well, God's done with that, because we know what happens whenever we say God will never do. He does. So that's personally where I fall. I know brothers that fall on the cessationist side. I know brothers that fall on the continuationist side. I think that that's a relatively minor issue. But the whole point of all this is, how do we get these gifts? Ultimately, God distributes it. How do I get the gift of miracles or healing if those things are still given out? God gives it. Well, why isn't He giving those gifts to the church in different parts of the world today? It may be that the church in that part of the world today doesn't need it. Okay? I don't see some of these in practice where I'm at in my context. But you know what I've heard from some missionaries from around the world? They go to some of these other places and they say, bro, God is still giving this miracle out today. He's given this gift. And it's in these places where there's little to no access to the gospel. So take what you want from that. God distributes as He wills, is kind of the point of that. He determines who gets what gift and when. And it's also possible that you might receive a gift at your salvation, and that's fine. But then as you mature, another gift begins to come to the surface, and God chooses to give you gifts later in your salvation. So that's certain also. Here's the third one, third note about gifts. Spiritual gifts are universal in that every Christian has at least one, probably more. Spiritual gifts are universal in that every Christian has at least one, probably more. What this implies is that everyone has a role in the growth of the church. If spiritual gifts are divine enablement for church growth, and everyone has a spiritual gift, then everyone has a role in the growth of the church. We see that in Ephesians chapter 4. The gift is given for the common good, and the pastor teachers equip the saints for the work of the ministry so that when the body is working together, it causes itself to grow and to mature. We see the same thing here in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Starting in verse 12, it says, just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. For in one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slave or free, and all were made to drink of one Spirit. For the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would be the sense of hearing? If the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? But as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each one of them as He chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, yet one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, the parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And on those parts of the body that we think less honorable, we bestow the greater honor. And our unpresentable parts are treated with greater modesty, which our more presentable parts do not require. But God has so composed the body, giving greater honor to the part that lacked it, that there may be no division in the body, but that the members may have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together. So everyone has a role in the growth of the church, especially those who think they are the most insignificant. It is not appropriate for you as a Christian, ever, to say, I have no useful role in the church. Now, you may not be exercising a useful role in that moment, but that doesn't mean that that role doesn't exist. It just means that you are not plugged into it yet. Here's what can happen sometimes, is we have this whole body and all these different things that need to be done, and then we notice a gap. We say, uh-oh, there's a gap that needs to be filled. God already knows who He's designed to fill that gap. But we see there's a gap that needs to be filled. And so what do we do as Christians? Self-sacrificing, okay, I'm going to fill that gap. And so you have people plugging in and filling holes. And what can happen over time sometimes is that you've got a large number of people in the church that have filled all these different positions that they're not really necessarily designed to fill. And there's a disproportionate amount of effort being placed on certain individuals in the church. Sometimes it's their fault. They've said yes to too many things. They have not learned the secret of saying no. That is not what I'm gifted to do. That is not what the Lord's calling me to do. Sometimes it's out of necessity. No one else is filling the gap. Specifically, there might be one person that's supposed to fill this gap, but in their spirit they've said, no, I just don't think I'm supposed to. And they're not being obedient yet, so someone else fills the gap instead. Whoever's fault it is, that is damaging to the body in the same way that it's damaging to our body whenever we pick up big, heavy boxes with our back instead of with our legs. Right? We can get the job done that way. We'll get the work done, but guess what's going to happen 10 years down the road? You're going to regret that you did it that way. Because there's an unnecessary strain placed on parts of the body. So that can happen when we're not all collectively coming together and using our gifts in the way that God has designed us. Someone else might have to fill a hole because of my disobedience. And sometimes I need to step out of a position so that the right person can fill that position and probably do a better job because that's what God has gifted them to do. So both of those things can be true. Everyone's got at least one gift, and almost certainly more. Usually, I don't think I've ever come across a single Christian that I've thought, well, they got this one gift and that's about it. I don't think I've seen that yet. I guess it could still happen, but take that for what it is. So here's the next observation about gifts. Some gifts are amplified traits that all Christians share. Some gifts are amplified traits that all Christians share. To give you an example of this, this is the best example, bar none. I think of this right here. Okay, amplified traits that we should all share. I think this right here, service. I would say generosity. Okay, gifts of mercy. Gifts of helps. Okay. These are all things that we all have to a degree. And this draws an interesting distinction, I'll make the point now, between what a spiritual gift is and what a fruit of the Spirit is. The fruits of the Spirit are not spiritual gifts and vice versa. So sometimes people are like, I have the spiritual gift of peace. Okay, that's not a spiritual gift. We should all have peace. And usually the way that's used is the opposite. I don't have the spiritual gift of peace, as a way to justify our lack of peace. I don't have, I think it's probably the one I've heard the most, I don't have the spiritual gift of patience. It's not a spiritual gift. That's just a fruit of the Spirit, something we should all possess anyway. So what I'm talking about here are these things that we might say, oh, well, those aren't really gifts. That's what we should have anyway. If you have the spiritual gift, one of these spiritual gifts, it is going to be an amplified version of that. That's how you know that you have that gift. So if we have it's the seeming same level of faith that everyone else has, it doesn't necessarily mean we don't have this gift, but it means it's likely you don't, or you haven't developed it. When I say the spiritual gift of faith, or the spiritual gift of service or generosity, I think it was maybe, and I don't know if this is a podcast or not, maybe it was a sermon that John Piper had given once. No, it was Ask Pastor John. It was a podcast. Because they asked about those martyrs who are overseas and their families are captured and they're told, if you do not deny the faith right now, I'm torturing your family in front of you. So deny Jesus. That is a gut-wrenching situation to imagine. I can't imagine that. So someone asked Pastor John, what is the moral obligation for the Christian in that moment? What am I to do? How is it that a missionary overseas or a Christian overseas can go through such torture, but then still come out and have tremendous faith? And I will never forget John Piper's answer because it was so helpful. He says, I believe in that moment, God gifts that believer with a tremendous amount of faith that is not normal in that moment. I don't know how I would respond in that moment. I like to think I would be the hero Christian that doesn't deny my faith and that God delivers my family and it's all going to work out. Maybe, maybe not. I believe in those moments there is a supernatural gifting of faith or of mercy to help sustain that person through that. That's the difference between the spiritual gift of faith and then just my regular faith. The spiritual gift of faith is going to be an amplified version of this. And it's manifested differently. I'm going to hang on this one because I've seen this one so much more. There was an individual at my previous church. I believe that this guy had the spiritual gift of faith. It seemed like something not working out was never a possibility. He was so confident. And he was always at the church. We had a corner room. It was an old office that they turned into a prayer room. And that was unlocked 24/7. And people would come by and sign up for hour-long slots. And they had a list of church members in this room. And they had some things to write cards for people. They had a prayer list that was up on the wall. People could make notes. And they'd come in for an hour and pray and write cards and maybe call people. And then just sit down and pray in the corner, read the scriptures. And so people would sign up for that. And so he was over this prayer ministry. So his job was to try to recruit people to come and pray. And this brother, if there wasn't a name on that slot, he was coming back up there to pray. Well, over time, less and less people would sign up for this prayer ministry. I never once heard him complain about having to go up to the church for another hour to pray. If I'm being honest, I could see myself getting bitter. Come on, people. He didn't. Why? Personally, I believe he had this one, and I believe he had this one. Supernatural. Okay? So there's different manifestations of these. If you have that gift, that's going to be an amplification of something that all Christians share. Which means we can't ever say, well, I just don't have the spiritual gift of faith to justify my lack of faith in that moment. Well, I just don't have the spiritual gift of mercy. No, but you're a Christian. You may not have the amplified version of this, but you got the regular one. So let's utilize that. Okay. Here's the next one. This is next to last, and then we got one more. Gifts can be developed and pursued. Spiritual gifts can be developed and pursued. This isn't something that it's just a magical gift. It's there, you got it, suddenly it's in full force. Okay? It's something that can be developed and pursued. And to give you an example of this, right at the very end of 1 Corinthians 12. You are the body of Christ and individually members of it. Verse 27. And God has appointed in the church apostles, prophets, teachers, then miracles, gifts of healing, helping, administration, various kinds of tongues. Are all prophets? Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Do all work miracles? Do all possess gifts of healing? Do all speak with tongues? Do all interpret? But eagerly desire the higher gifts. We are to pursue those gifts that will be most beneficial to the church. I don't think it's wrong to recognize I'm in this church, here's my church dynamic, and there's a gap in our church. No one is filling this gap. I wonder if God has called me to fill this, and to start to put yourself out there and just see if it's something that He's drawing you towards. That's a good and right thing to do. Now, that doesn't mean just because there's a gap that you're designed for that, but you could be. You won't know till you pursue it. And I'll give you an example of this. I'm probably going to get punched later. If I show up at Bruises tomorrow, you know. My wife is an excellent example of this. Okay? I love you. Sorry to call you out in public, but it is what it is. So she has been asked multiple times in my marriage to teach a Sunday school class, usually for youth, sometimes by me because I'm really in a crunch and I need a youth Sunday school teacher. Okay? But sometimes not. And she has filled in that gap. She will tell you right now, I just don't know that this is one of my spiritual gifts. I think she does it well, but she recognizes I'm just not certain. But you know what she does every time? She's at least willing to pursue. And so, I will test the waters and see, and we'll find out. And sometimes she comes back and says, nope, not meant to be. Sometimes she comes back and says, yes, this feels right now. Okay? So it's okay to pursue a gift that you think, I don't know if I have that, but I'm going to just test it and see. And to work on developing your gifts, teaching especially, exhortation, words of wisdom and words of knowledge, administration. These are things that have to be developed. It's not just a kind of a light switch on and off. Okay. Last one here. We've kind of hit on this a little bit, but I want to really specifically say it. The gifts that seem the smallest are sometimes the most vital. And I'm going to come back to this one right here. Spiritual gift of faith. The gift that seem the smallest are sometimes the most vital. So someone might say, oh, well, you trust God better than most people. Big deal. The gift of faith often leads to increased prayer for the church or martyrdom when the church is at its weakest so that the church might explode in times of necessity. This is huge for the church. Prayer is not some optional kind of tag on to what we do. Prayer is the source of our power. Let me tell you who the best prayers are, the people that have this gift. Because they know, it's not even a question. God's going to answer. He's going to do what I tell him to do because I have his ear. I'm his child. And when a certain prayer isn't answered, they don't say, they say, well, it wasn't God's will. But you know what? I'm going to pray this now. And they're ready to go. So we might look at this and go, oh, well, the gift of helps, big deal. Like we can all help. Okay, the gift of service, what is this? The gift of teaching, we have enough teachers. You know, the gift of spiritual discernment, well, we all can do, we can all tell that this guy's a jerk or we think this guy's a Christian or whatever. You can look at any of these and say, that's not really as significant as this other gift. And let me tell you where this happens the most, is we look at the pastor and say, well, that's the pastor of the church. So his gift is the most important. That is not true. Not true. All of these gifts, especially the ones that seem the most insignificant, are the most vital. Imagine a church where no one is expressing the gift of mercy. You think that church is going to stay together long? I think not. How are you going to be around a whole bunch of people that never show mercy? That gets old. This is glue that holds the church together. You can have great teaching and you can have great exhortation and words of knowledge, but if you don't like being around the people there, it's just not going to work. So the gifts that seem the smallest are sometimes the most vital. Okay? Spiritual gifts, this is how the church operates. Whenever these come together, the church experiences unity. In this passage, I believe over here also, it references the number 1 over and over and over again. One body, one spirit. One body, one spirit. Each gift is given. Here in Ephesians chapter 4, the verses right before this are about unity. Spiritual gifts are designed to bring the church together and equip the church so that we can go out and reach the world with the gospel, bring them in, teach them what it looks like to be a Christian, and then send them back out again. And it's this never-ending fountain of ministry. This is how that happens, okay?